Awesome, everyone. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Intersectionality and Work-Life Balance. My name is Daniel Anzueto, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's session. If this is your first time attending one of our workshops, let me provide some context on Startout. Startout accelerates the growth of the LGBTQ plus community to drive its economic empowerment, building a world where every LGBTQ plus entrepreneur has equal access to lead, succeed, and shape the workforce of the future. I'm excited to introduce Graham Gallivan. Graham is a queer-identified therapist in practice in San Francisco, California. In his practice, he brings a comprehensive, holistic approach to healing, integrating all domains of life, from relationship to spirituality to work and beyond, and draws on his own experience of healing in these areas to support well-being. Previously, Graham worked for over 15 years at companies in the technology space and understands the challenges unique to that space of finding meaning in work and maintaining work-life balance. Graham, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Danny. And thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to join for this content. I really appreciate it. And nice to see all of you here and nice to meet you. I will start the slide deck here. So a little bit, I know Danny gave a little bit of an intro. Thank you so much for that. And just to kind of build off of that a little bit. So yeah, I'm a queer therapist and practice and private practice here in San Francisco and also throughout California. And I've worked for over 15 years in the corporate world, specifically in the tech space. In my practice, I work a lot with folks who have an LGBTQ plus identity, and also work with folks around challenges and stress around work, relationship, spirituality, those kinds of things. And then kind of just a quick disclaimer so that my role today is as a presenter, so not as a therapist or a clinician aligned with this group in that way. So it's probably self-evident, but just wanted to make sure folks were clear on that. And okay, let's dive in a little bit. So kind of to set the table, I want to talk a little bit about something that I think in a certain way is self-evident to everybody at this point, given that we're crazily almost 4 years into this, or past this, we could say at this point. But it's this concept of kind of remote work, right? And so, and how that kind of intersects with work-life balance. So of course, at the beginning of, as we all can recall, at the beginning of the pandemic, the landscape of kind of work and our experience of work changed really dramatically, and you could say irrevocably, with folks shifting to online. And so what did that look like? Of course, not necessarily kind of something consistently the same from person to person, but in many cases, we could say that with fewer kind of non-professional outlets to engage in, increased kind of on-the-clock time was something that emerged as a possibility for folks. So that could be if you have a, in the context of how you work, I know all of you are kind of entrepreneurs as well. Could be if you have a collaboration tool like a Slack or something that you use for yourself or with your team, or email, for example. All these things, these sort of intersections with technology that are kind of connection with them and relationship to them shifted and maybe became a little more, we could say, involved. And so so kind of just to set the table a little bit and kind of set the context and how I want to talk today a little bit about how can we be more mindful about maintaining balance and our experience of ourself with our work self and kind of our self and our personal lives. And also, how do our identities, whatever they are, across either the LGBTQ plus spectrum or an identity of race or ability, or it could be even the identity of neurodiversity, how do all these identities impact how we think about and also our openness to kind of socializing, how we're approaching that commitment to maintaining work-life balance. So let me dive in a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit about boundaries. So I know at this point, boundaries is this concept that I think has in many ways made its way into the kind of popular, you could say, lexicon of kind of pop psychology. And of course, it still continues to be a concept that is this relevant in the space of psychology and psychotherapy. But just to kind of recap what they are. So they're the limits that we set for ourselves across the various domains in our lives. And that could be in relationships. So that could be family relationship, romantic relationship, etc. Could be how we approach boundaries as they relate to our health. So it could be exercise, nutrition, etc. And then of course it could be how we approach the way that we think about them in the context of our kind of work and personal lives, and how we kind of maintain balance in those areas. And when we think about work-life balance, it's what I typically would call a time boundary. So how we think about and manage our time, and how we allow others to intersect with that, like, take our time, so to speak, or how we just think about managing our time in that way. And I want to just quickly kind of reference a quote by Brene Brown, who many of you may be familiar with, or maybe you follow Brene Brown on LinkedIn or on other kind of social platforms. But so Brene Brown, in the context of boundaries, says, choose discomfort over resentment. And how I kind of interpret that is that setting boundaries can lead to what may feel like uncomfortable conversations sometimes. But what's important is to allow yourself to feel the discomfort of setting a boundary, especially if it's maybe the first time that you've done it, or if it's not a kind of muscle motion that feels familiar to you, versus like maybe the resentment that could come up if you were to choose not to communicate. The resentment that could kind of develop, let's say, kind of develop over time. Um, and and so, all right, like, how can we think about implementing boundaries, kind of operationalizing that in a work context? So a couple things that I like to share with folks as possible tips, even like steps that you can take if it's something that you feel like you want to try, and you haven't tried in the past. And the first is to kind of step back and reflect and say, hey, what is the relationship? What would the relationship look like that I would like to have with my work? Like almost just to have a kind of dry erase board in front of you, even like figuratively, and say like, what would it look like if I wanted to have the relationship that felt like the most consistent with how I want to manage my work and my personal life. Like, so things to consider might be like, is there a desired schedule that you want to keep within the framework of what would work and be relevant to you within the framework of your work? And I also like to say here that kind of getting clear on those things, like kind of sitting down and saying, hey, what do I really want? What would feel good to me? What would feel meaningful to me? Sometimes that can be like feel like maybe the most kind of challenging step to take, kind of like the first step, so to speak. And then the next steps are, like, I'd say next step or steps are really kind of just putting it into process. And this kind of can look differently for folks depending on what setting you're working in. I know, all of you are entrepreneurs, and so it could be that you're a one man so let's keep this gender neutral, a one person shop, right? Like it could be that you have a small team. It could be that you are also, it could be that maybe like maybe what you're doing entrepreneurially as a side hustle, maybe you're doing something in an organizational setting at the same time, right? So I know that we have folks across like sort of various experiences of work. But kind of to make a plan of like, what would it look like to socialize how you want to approach this balance between work and personal life, and then to take the step of communicating it. And here again, this could look in various ways, to folks depending on what work setting you're in. But who do you need to communicate it to? Like if it's a bigger team, like are there do you need to communicate it to the entire team? Are there folks like in your kind of immediate work circle that you'd want to communicate it to? But who would make the most sense to share this information with, and kind of, so to speak, like set the boundaries? And just to kind of quickly reiterate this quote from Brene Brown of allowing yourself here to feel the discomfort of setting the boundaries versus maybe like the resentment that might come up if you don't, right? Especially if this is not a new experience of setting boundaries, because oftentimes if depending on your communication style and how direct maybe you experience yourself to be, it could be something that might feel could be information that feels easy to share and like flow naturally. Sometimes it can bring stuff up, so really kind of just allowing yourself to, if emotions or experiences do come up, allowing yourself to experience that, versus maybe kind of what could develop into experience of resentment or frustration over time. And then, of course, I want to talk a little bit about like our identities and the intersection of our identities and how that can impact how we think about setting boundaries as well, right? And a number of things, of course, come into play here. So, and like I said, I know that there's so many identities. I know that this organization is, so we could say, chartered around kind of supporting folks in the LGBTQ plus space, but I know folks have like various identities that are outside that space as well, across kind of racial identity or identity of ability, kind of like I was referencing at the beginning of our call today, or could be an identity of some experience of neurodiversity, for example, as well. So all of that, of course, is relevant as we kind of pull into play these various, we could say, kind of vectors that impact our experience of thinking about, kind of claiming what we want for maintaining work-life balance, and how we go about communicating it. And the first would be, and this, of course, is by no means, I would say, by no means like an exhaustive list. And here again, I won't say that any of this will necessarily not be like self-evident to a lot of folks on the call, but I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge these things as we think about, our experience. The first being kind of this idea of, discrimination and stigma. So can we theoretically feel resistant to setting boundaries because of an experience, like either a perceived experience of discrimination, or if we've had an experience of discrimination, and maybe an expectation that something might come up for us around that. Could be sort of social or societal conditioning. Does how we experience ourselves and our identity impact how we set boundaries in that way? This can show up in so many ways. It could be an experience within an identity of internalized oppression, even within our own identity. Like how maybe have we grown to marginalize ourselves within our identity, and within the community of our certain identity, and how can that impact how we think about setting boundaries? And then stereotypes, of course, too. Like, have we experienced being stereotyped in the past? Like, can that experience or an expectation of that experience impact how we think about like our identity and setting boundaries? And I'll disclose a little bit from my own personal experience here. So I have a queer identity. I'm a gay identified male. I also identify as a white cisgendered person as well, and am of course familiar and want to acknowledge the privileges that I know come with that too. I think it's important to do that in this space. And I want to talk a little bit about my identity, specifically as a gay male in the work context. I know I referenced at the beginning of our call today that have worked historically for a number of years in the technology space. And this is an experience that I had with a close friend who was a coworker in a space, who was experiencing some discrimination in the work setting, around work-life balance. So this person was also gay. They were queer, and they had an experience of there being a higher expectation of the amount of time that they would be we could say kind of contributing. They would be contributing, and the amount of time that they would be committing to work. because there was this sense, we could say stereotypically, of maybe they're having more time available, like not having a family, not having a partner, not having a family, whatever kind of could be sort of commitments that somebody might have in their personal life. And so based upon that, having an experience of higher expectation of what they would be willing to do. Travel specifically was something that was coming up. And so I kind of just want to share that, because I know that these things, we can talk about these things kind of conceptually, like in the abstract, but they're real, and our experience of them is real. And so it's important to kind of, as we think about setting boundaries and thinking about them, and even like feeling resistance if it comes up around them, it's important to kind of acknowledge these things as they come up too. So, okay, let me move on and talk a little bit about, like, shift gears a little bit and talk about work stress and kind of decreasing work stress. So I know we're talking about setting boundaries and maintaining work-life balance today. And I kind of want to just say, and I know think everybody kind of has a sense of this as well, that stress, kind of stress in our lives, either in a work context or outside of a work context, is kind of a given. We could say it's just a part of kind of, part of the experience and our kind of modern civilization, and how our nervous systems work, and kind of what we have like coming at us at any given time. And so I want to just share with that in mind, like, what are some things that we can do to support ourselves and our nervous systems day to day, to give ourselves like the best opportunity to feel, to feel kind of grounded and supported and resourced, knowing that we might have stress come up. And so there are a few things that I think can be really important, or that can be really helpful. One is to kind of identify maybe decompressing activities that help you decompress, that feel good to you. And these vary, of course, for people, like based on, really just kind of based on your interest level. So if you're into like physical activity, it could be anything across that spectrum, from walking to yoga to something that maybe is more vigorous, like running or something like that. If you're into kind of more meditative type activities, I'm not saying that anybody's necessarily, that these are mutually exclusive. It could be that people are interested in multiple or all of these things, right? But if you like sort of more meditative type practices, that could be deep breathing, it could be meditation, it could be even sitting and listening to music. But to kind of identify those activities that that help you feel good, and maybe kind of almost like reactivate, kind of, press that like reset button for you. And then as it feels relevant or kind of valid, kind of consistent with your day to day, to even kind of calendar them throughout the day. To calendar a few minutes here or there, wherever you feel you can do it. And even if you're someone that is really just kind of, whatever kind of the nature of your work might be, but if you're just sort of at your desk, all day long, they're things that you can do, that would even, that you could take 30 seconds to do even while you're sitting at your desk. Could be deep breathing, could be just kind of doing some gentle stretching, like kind of in your sort of certain specific space at that time, that can really help, and reboot our nervous systems. And kind of, vis-a-vis this topic, I want to take a few seconds and share a guided meditation with everybody here, as kind of an example of, just, we could say, like, kind of as an example of something that that you could implement. And maybe that folks on the call already do meditation, but if you don't, this could be kind of an example of a meditation for you to see, kind of a sampler, like, so to speak, for you to see if it feels like something that feels good to you. And I'll just say, like, and it'll just take we'll take a few minutes and do it. And what I want to say too is, like, participation is totally voluntary. Like, nobody has to participate if they don't want to. And feel free to participate kind of in any way that you want to as well. So if I'm like sharing a prompt, feel free to kind of follow it or not. And what I want to share too is like, I think you'll kind of know by the end of it if it feels good or not. Like I feel like these practices are things where it's like, after 2 or 3 minutes, like, hey, that helped, or no, that doesn't help. And you can kind of like you sort of like carve away the things that don't feel good. So I think like by the end of this, if you haven't like tried meditation before, you'll know, hey, I like this, or you know what, that's not for me. So okay, let's take a few minutes and do this. And like I said, totally voluntary, totally voluntarily about how you want to engage. But for folks that do want to engage, if you want to close your eyes, which of course is totally voluntary too, and then see if you can envision yourself floating on a kind of big fluffy cloud. And you can be sitting or reclined or kind of on your side or however you imagine yourself to be most comfortable. And as you peer over the side of the cloud, you see that you are floating over this really beautiful landscape down below. You see this kind of beautiful lake vignette with people sitting around, kind of recreating around the lake with picnics, and enjoying the water. Some folks have like their feet in the water. And so there's some folks actually swimming and playing in the water too. And then now as you peer over the other side of the cloud, you see a really beautiful like farmscape down below you with these kind of rolling hills of fruit orchards. There's a vineyard as well. And there's also this really pretty kind of rustic farmhouse. And then now, as you peer over the side of the cloud, you see a really lovely kind of peaceful forest canopy with birds and butterflies kind of frolicking above the canopy. And you also feel the warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze brushing past you as you're floating on this cloud too. And then now, as you peer over the side of the cloud, you see that you're floating just basically right above the ground. You're like hovering right above the ground. And you kind of easily slide off of the cloud onto the ground and plant both of your feet there and experience yourself feeling grounded and relaxed and kind of renewed. And then when you're ready, you can, if you closed your eyes, you can open them back up. Okay. So there's a kind of an example of a guided meditation for folks to see if it's something that feels, if they feel interested in or not, as a possible tool to support your nervous system throughout the day. Yeah. Okay, I want to kind of run through a few quick slides around resources as well as I move towards kind of the end of the content that I have prepared, and before we move into Q&A as folks have it. So some specific resources around work-life balance. So a couple of reading resources for folks. One is a blog. It's a specific blog entry actually about how you can set boundaries at work. And also too, just a quick aside, I did check in with Danny, and we'll send out these slides to you all after the presentation today, so you'll have access to these resources via that deck, via this deck, so to speak. The other is, so no need to kind of scribble stuff down unless you just want to right now, but another is a book called Set Boundaries, Find Peace, which has come out in the past couple of years. So I think it's super relevant, has a lot of great information and tools that are available. And then for folks who do like breathing and meditation and those kinds of things, of course, there are tons of, there are lots and lots and lots of apps out there that help with this, which I think is great. So I've included just one here that I think can be really helpful, and it's available across operating systems, called iBreathe. So that's kind of an example of a possibility for you too. Therapy resources. So I think I referenced this at the beginning, but for folks who are interested, I have a practice that's based in California. I see folks both in person in San Francisco and also virtually throughout California, and work with folks around things that come up around LGBT plus identity, depression, anxiety, spiritual crisis, trauma, relationship, substance abuse, or substance use. And I have all my contact information here if you ever want to reach out, or if you know somebody that might be interested. And I have a link to my LinkedIn profile too, where I'm fairly active, so you can follow me there as well. And a few other resources specific to our LGBT plus identities. The first one is, it's mental health resources. Some of them are specific to the San Francisco Bay Area. So if you're not in that area, then that some of it won't necessarily be relevant, but there are also things in there that are relevant kind of across geographies, either within the continental US or outside of it as well. And then a couple of national resources that are available and I think are really good too. National Alliance on Mental Illness, also known as NAMI, has a lot of great resources. The Trevor Project, which is really great as well. And then I have a link here to the GLBT National Hotline, which can be a really good tool for folks to call if they need support kind of in the moment. And so that pretty much concludes my my prepared content, and then happy to kind of take questions as folks have them, or comments, or whatever might be coming up for folks too. And thank you all for bearing with me and participating and being here today.
Fantastic, Graham. Thank you so much for your time today. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You're welcome to come off video if you'd like and share them verbally as well. Question for you, Graham. So we do all this work for ourselves and on ourselves. How do we make sure that folks around us are able to understand where we're setting boundaries in a healthy way? What can we communicate to people? How can we share that with them if all of a sudden they're like, oh, you're such a different person?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's so relevant because depending on who we're connecting with, like who we're talking to, an experience of setting boundaries kind of can be jarring, and it can almost feel like, for other people, it can theoretically feel like a personality shift, especially if these are people that we're close to, like in our personal life. It could be like our nuclear family, or family of origin, or family of choice, or it could be romantic relationship or personal relationship or whatever. So it could be, it can come up even like more frequently in these like kind of intimate relationships of folks around us than in our work life. Although it can also come up in our work life too, especially if we have intimate relationships with folks there. But sometimes it can be more magnified in these more personal, intimate relationships that we have with folks, because Yeah, our relationships the way that we approach our relationships can become more, it can become really structured, can become really specific. And so if we shift in that way, it can kind of disrupt a balance that people are used to, a kind of like a homeostasis, we can say, that we're used to. And so all that to say is that it can throw people off and people can have a reaction. And what I like to say about that, and those reactions can really vary depending on who that person is and what they have going on, whatever. And so if we set a boundary, especially if it's like, I guess I should put my hand more this way. I don't want it to look like I'm like chopping a block or something. But if we set a boundary, it can cause let's just acknowledge in this space, it can cause a reaction in other people, and we might not always know what that is going to be. So how I like to just support folks around that is to, one, acknowledge, be aware that might happen, and two, um, stick with it. Like we don't setting, like I kind of said before, I mean, setting boundaries, it's not necessarily, especially if it's kind of a new, motion for us, it may not feel easy, it may not feel natural. And we may get responses that we don't necessarily expect. But for us to just kind of hold the line and to where we feel comfortable to if we want to contextualize, to share with folks our reasoning around it. I don't necessarily feel like this is something that has to be the case across the board. If you're setting a boundary, it's because of something that's important to you, and how I kind of almost think about it in the context of, like, we could think of it this way, of like, of our identities, and how people maybe have historically expected us to share about our own experience, when that can be super taxing, right? Like, you kind of want to just, have folks know that they need to be doing their own work, especially if they want to show up as allies. Sort of the same thing, sort of the same idea around boundaries. It's sort of like, it can be a gift for you to give them, to share, share your experience and contextualize it in a certain way as much as you want to. And yeah, at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that you can do so kind of at your discretion and what feels kind of comfortable to you. But at the end of the day, if it's something that feels important to you to set as a boundary, to just continue to move forward with it and do it, and know that it might bring up some discomfort. So I hope that helps, and can share some more color if folks have any comments or other things around it too.
That's fantastic, Graham. Thank you. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to ask. Graham, if you want to drop your email or website or whatever link in the chat, I think that would also be helpful.
Yeah, of course. You just
I
hop
have a
out.
quick question, Graham.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
as founders, we're supposed to be these, I don't know, bastions of just being on top of everything, and showing vulnerability sometimes can be uncomfortable, sure, but I feel like depending on your audience, it could almost become a bit of a power struggle. For example, I'm identify as non-binary in a very, very male-dominated space, and I'm often in meetings with folks who are men, but they're also older, and more experienced in the field. So there's this balance of
Right.
wanting to be the founder who understands things and is powerful, for lack of a better term, or at least appears that way, but also vulnerable to some extent, to not only connect with folks, but also just to be open and honest. And I feel like sometimes that can draw away from that power position in a way. So how do you recommend balancing this line of vulnerability? It's kind of a
Yeah.
loaded question, but that's where my head's been at a lot recently. I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, totally. Um, oh my gosh, I think I think it's such a great question. And how do we kind of, I mean, what's coming up for me around it's kind of like, how do we take care of ourselves too? Like, I know that that's a lot of what we're talking about today in the context of setting boundaries and how we can think about maintaining balance between our work and personal lives. But how are we, especially as we experience ourselves and our own identity, I know we're talking specifically about like maybe like gender identity and like a non-binary identity, and in the space of like in these spaces that are in these spaces that are traditionally kind of cisgendered male and white, and how can we show up and set boundaries and also allow ourselves to the degree that we feel comfortable, be vulnerable. And I really feel like kind of makes me think a little bit about like the first question. It's sort of like how we how we kind of allow ourselves to be vulnerable in a certain way. We could say is like it could kind of be like, I mean, I know gift is sort of a strange word too, but like it's the onus is not on us, so to speak, necessarily to show up with vulnerability unless we necessarily want to, and feel comfortable doing it. And if we do it in that setting, to almost imagine like, hey, I am modeling for these people the kind of behavior that could be useful to all of us, like as a team, regardless of what our identities are. And yet it's not necessarily something that I have to do unless I just want to. And so I kind of just want to say first, like to acknowledge kind of the experience that you're having, which I know is what you're doing, and say, hey, like this is an experience that I am having in the space that comes up for me at times, and just acknowledge the experience that you're having, and to be as you feel comfortable, really kind of connected to the idea of the boundaries that you want to set for yourself, of like how you want to communicate, the degree that you want to, share your experience, your any kind of emotional experience that you're having in the moment, whatever, and to be have like, and I think I just want to say this is like kind of a blanket statement, like across the board, to be, to have like an ongoing, like really, consistent practice of like empathy towards yourself, like self-empathy, of saying like, you know what, I'm here, I am doing this, like these are spaces that can, in any kind of different way, maybe feel you know challenging, or that there is a mix of identities that is entrenched in these spaces, and to have a real kind of devoted, committed sense of empathy towards yourself and the experience that you're having, and that can really go a long way too, of maintaining that. And also kind of, I know we're talking today about like supporting our nervous systems. That can really help a lot, kind of with like rebooting our nervous systems too, as a sort of like sense of self-care and like empathy towards ourselves. That can also help a lot too. So I know that's been kind of like a rambling response across like a couple different areas. So I'm happy to kind of like, if there are other questions that are coming up around it or whatever, I'm totally happy to answer those too. And I want to say that I really appreciate the question too.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so my name is Jamila Bryant. I'm the founder of Push Forward Development, which is a company that focuses on leadership, professional development, and also financial services for the LGBTQ plus community. So my apologies for being tardy. I had another meeting. I still work a 9 to 5 currently, but that's okay. So basically, I saw this opportunity to join this conversation because of my, marginalized identities that I navigate through the world with. And I'm also, I speak a part of Push Forward as well. So I have my first speaking engagement this year, a paid one, that I'll be talking about intersectionality. So I was just actually wanting to attend the portion I can see, to get some point of views on how you look at intersectionality, especially from a business owner, a queer business owner.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so and what I guess what I can say is I know we covered, first of all, thank you so much for being here, and I'm super excited about your organization. It sounds totally amazing. And I know one thing that we'll do after the presentation today is circulate the slides out to everybody. So you'll totally have access to all the content that I have in the deck, and specifically around kind of intersectionality of identities and approaching work-life balance in that way. So so feel free to however you feel fit to use any of that,
Jamila, you're muted, Jamila.
Sorry. Yeah, so I was saying that I've done my own research over the last couple of months since I first met with this university. And then, of course, my lived experience as a Black queer woman with an X, growing up in West Philly, doing high school and college in South Carolina, traveled around the world with the military, and now living in Denver, Colorado. So bringing those lenses as well, to the table as I do this first speaking engagement for a conversation about intersectionality, in particular with STEM, because this is a STEM audience, the university that I'll be speaking at.
Cool. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's so great. And I know it's good. It sounds like it's going to be a terrific opportunity. And I'm super excited for you and wishing you all the best. Yeah, of course. And it's so happy to have you here today too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for hosting this space as well.
Of course, my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here. Happy to take any other questions if folks have them as well. And I've also popped my info into the chat too, if folks have any follow-up questions for me too. Happy to connect offline.
Awesome, Graham. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Graham's contact information is on the screen in the chat, and you'll also receive it when we send the recording with the slides. Expect that by tomorrow. Thank you all so much for joining us. Check out StartOut's website for more upcoming events, and we'll see you soon. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.